A reading from the Gospel of John. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Good evening, Diocese of New Hampshire. Thank you for this opportunity to join you at your virtual convention. And thank you, Bishop Rob, for that introduction, although I've got to admit, I almost missed it. Such is the nature of these virtual meetings. I had to go and yell at my kids that the time had come for them to be silent for the next 20 minutes. So we'll see. I've got the door behind me. If they come running in, we know what happens. I bring you greetings from my hometown, from Birmingham, Alabama, and from our diocese here and from the presiding bishop's office, especially our team from Church Planting and Redevelopment. It's just been so exciting to see the work that you all are doing in New Hampshire, and we're thrilled to continue walking along beside you in that and learning from you. I wanted to tell you about a letter that I have been in the process of writing. I've got about a week left to finish it. It's a letter to my friend Jack. Jack is the founder, and you might say the patron saint of the long distance running group that I'm a part of on weekends. Like all of God's saints, he is wise and discerning. And like a few of God's saints, Jack has autism, which has given him a lot of challenges in this life. His mom rides a bicycle next to us where she carries all of our pickles and drinks and Powerade and snacks and all that. And as she bikes, she's told me a lot about these challenges, about the dire predictions that doctors and teachers made about Jack when he was young, about how schools told her that he was dumb and would never learn anything, how he would never read or ever be able to work, and definitely that he would never run marathons. And she's just so proud of him, as we all are, for trouncing those dire predictions and expectations. But to tell you a little bit more about this group, it's about 7 people, and it is a very motley crew. There's the guy and his husband who just adopted an 11-year-old with severe emotional and behavioral issues. So every week he's been suspended again. There's the woman who was disowned by her own relatives and has adopted this running group as her family. And that's all on top of how slowly we run. Like, we are not fast at all. We can go for a long time, but very slowly. And there's usually somebody yelling, and there's somebody complaining, and sometimes somebody is bleeding. Usually somebody's got a big armload of books that they've taken out of one of those little libraries in somebody's yard. And it's just funny. We make such a spectacle running down the street that drivers will roll down their windows just to like cheer us on, which makes me think, wow, they don't have a lot of confidence in our ability to like reach our final destination. That's what we look like. Are my running buddies churchgoers? Absolutely not. And I'm from Alabama. This is the Bible Belt, right? I think that if I asked, most of them would say that they are spiritual. They would probably say that they are religious, that they're Jesus followers, but they have no sense that living out that following of Jesus involves going to church on Sunday mornings. Like, they'd just rather go run with Jack. And to tell you the truth, a lot of the time I would too. So I'm writing Jack this letter because I want him to know what belonging to his running group means to me. Here's a little excerpt. Dear Jack, last fall, we were 8 months into this COVID pandemic. The initial excitement and chaos of quarantine had worn off. And I realized that I hadn't heard from many of my friends in months. Actually, I wasn't sure that I had any friends at all anymore. And it was the day that I was at my absolute lowest and most depressed that I heard my phone ding. Lo and behold, it was a text message from our mutual friend, Kevin. Hey, Katie, we're going running from the parking deck at Target tomorrow at 7:00 a.m. if you want to get up early and come with us. So thank you, Jack, for helping pull me out of a dark place in which I was feeling very alone. And thank you for inviting me into a space where I can feel the presence of God, not from behind an altar, not from the safe, watertight ark of the church building, but out in the open, on the streets, on full display, and in real time. And I'm wondering, if there's anything about that, about this story that is resonating with you. In particular, during the pandemic, or maybe before the pandemic, could you identify a place or a group of people where you have watched the sacramental life of God play out? Not in a church, but on this big stage, right? The stage of life. If I hadn't told my husband and my kids that they had to be silent and go into the back room during the sermon, he would be laughing at me as I tell you that I would describe myself as a hopeful pessimist. I believe that the 12 or so months that we Episcopalians have spent, actually maybe longer in certain parts of the country, forced outside of our church buildings is one of the best things that's ever happened to us. COVID's not the best thing that's ever happened to us, right? That's been a terrible tragedy in our country. But this shock of exile from our sacred spaces, it's invited us to ask at least 2 life-altering questions. The first one is this: how is God at work outside the walls of the churches and in our neighborhoods? Now, I know it kind of took us a while to dig down deep into that question. At least in my diocese, we had to go through this initial phase of almost like one-upmanship, right? My Zoom is bigger than your Zoom. We just bought $25,000 worth of audiovisual equipment. We're getting 20,000 Facebook Live views on our services, all that kind of stuff, right? But then this started to go on long enough that we went deeper. My guess is that lay people actually went deeper more quickly than the clergy did. Folks like my friend Dolly began to describe the mornings that they spent handing out free coffee and breakfast in the coffee shop parking lot as her church. Communities of care have been formed to man food pantries, to help people facing eviction and natural disasters, and to combat loneliness. And in the aftermath of George Floyd and possibly the most divisive national election of all time, Jesus followers have found ourselves asking deeply, and sometimes very painfully, who is my neighbor? And then there's the second question. What is the essential ingredient of church? Like, what is church? If you prune back all the flowers and the bark and the music and the bells and the pews, what's the mustard seed that Jesus talks about of faith? What is it made of? It's an anxiety-producing question. Some of my clergy friends had almost existential crises in the last year, realizing that they had lost all control. And many of us are still running on those kinds of fumes, dealing with like the masking. Do we do it? Do we not? Do we have enough money in the bank? The elephant in the room that most of our churches are half the size that they were before the pandemic, that kind of anxiety. But what is the mustard seed? What's left? The Sunday after the January 6th attack on the Capitol building, I was supply preaching at my husband's church, St. Thomas. This congregation, right, it was used to having, maybe 140 folks on a Sunday morning. And in January, Alabamians are wimps about the cold. There were 17 people in the congregation, and they were bundled up like they were ready for an Arctic expedition. I mean, mufflers, scarves, hoods, all that kind of stuff. And as I looked out, I knew most of the people. I knew most of the faces and the names. There was the woman who attends the church Thanksgiving lunch every year because she's got no living family. There's the youth minister who wasn't able to come out as gay in his home parish, but has found safety and his fullest self at St. Thomas. The family of 4 that never misses a Sunday, and the nearly 80-year-old man who I know still can't forgive himself for what happened in Vietnam. And I just had this feeling that I was sitting with the core of the church. Like I was sitting with that mustard seed, just the rawest form of this congregation at its most naked. And I couldn't help thinking of that passage in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus says, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. What a way of describing that mustard seed, that kernel of the church, that bond that we have in faith that the gates of hell cannot bust apart. They're just not capable of it. What is it? Is it that place where we bring our woundedness before God and before each other? The place where we gather with others in faith to wait in sure and certain hope of resurrection? Of the place to take action along with others who believe in Jesus when he said, the first will be last and the last will be first. These are the mustard seeds, right, of the church at their very rawest, at their very simplest. Everything else that we do it's a gardening tool for that mustard seed. I love this story, as probably we all do, about the raising of Lazarus, this gospel for All Saints' Day. And as I was thinking about what to say to you, what conversation to share with you, I played around with, can we compare the Episcopal Church to Lazarus? We're a denomination in decline, have been for decades. We've just been through a pandemic. We've been asleep. We're looking for a story that reveals light and life at the end of a dark tunnel. But as I was playing around with that, I thought about this running group that I'm a part of and what they would say if they heard the story of Lazarus. I think they would laugh if I compared Lazarus to the Episcopal Church. I think they would say, hey, if God's going to do some raising from the dead, we'd rather he start with those children that were killed in the drone strike in Afghanistan. Or we'd rather he started with our loved ones who have died of COVID. In other words, I think they're in a place, maybe they've gotten me to a place, maybe you're in a place where we want to see the resurrection played out. Not in an institution and not in super churchy language, but in real life. Jesus kind of says this to Martha. You remember, she's the one who steps out of the wake to go meet Jesus on the road. And she gives him this institutional, safe response to Lazarus's death. She says, I know that my brother will live again at the resurrection on the last day, a long time from now. And Jesus replies to her by saying, well, actually, I'm the resurrection and the life. And I'm going to go right now and tell Lazarus to come out. And it's not going to be safe. It's not going to be pretty. It won't be what you expected. And it won't be in the timeline that you thought. But it will be a sign that God is alive and active in the world. And the life you're longing for is a whole lot more powerful than the death you fear. And so because of all this, I love the theme of your diocesan convention, right? Deep roots, new life. The deep roots push down from that mustard seed of faith, connecting us to centuries of saints who have looked to God in hope. Saints who have served God and God's people, which are really one and the same, I think, through times of persecution, times of peace, times of war, and times of plague, times of zeal and zealousness, and times when people have lost their faith in transcendence. The new life begins to occur when we ask how we proclaim the certainty of that resurrection to the people in our neighborhoods. It happens when we identify and join with places that are not religious at all, but are making God's love known nonetheless. New life happens when we take the same good news of Jesus Christ, but we use different gardening tools to tend the seeds. Tools that are designed for the particular kind of soil that we're nurturing in this age. And new life happens when we go looking for those gardeners, aka leaders of the church, those gardeners who know how to till this particular kind of soil. New life involves pruning and watering and fertilizing and weeding and grafting. In my experience, it involves a lot of stained pant legs, muddy shoes, and in Alabama, the occasional run-in with fire ants. And quite often, like with several of the fruit trees out in my backyard, there is no fruit in the first season. And then 3 years from the planting, the tree just suddenly drops 600 plums on the ground faster than we can pick or use them. I want you to know, Diocese of New Hampshire, that you are among the leaders of this new life in the Episcopal Church. I wonder if you know that. Because of where you are, because of who you are, because of the swiftness of religious and cultural change in your context, and also because of the faithfulness and the creativity and bravery and courage of your leaders, some who I have met and others who I have yet to meet. You're one of the dioceses that the rest of us are looking to help us better understand how to preach this message of resurrection to a world that increasingly doesn't know the Jesus story as good news, and to a church that isn't sure how it's going to move forward without the numbers and the privilege that it once had. So I'm looking forward to learning from your stories of new life and transformation and how you're going to carry forward that message of eternal love that's been handed down to us by all the saints. So to end, I'm going to give you just a little addendum to this running group story that has been pestering me all week. Last week, we're training for a marathon. And last week we went out to run that final, like really long 20-miler in preparation. And it took us probably 4.5 hours. We're so slow. But we were back at the cars eating the pickles, and we were drinking mimosas to celebrate. And one of the runners who had been running ahead of me, so we hadn't been talking to each other, she comes up and she says, "Hey, Katie, we've been talking and we want to officially designate you as the priest of our running group. Do you think you could start a church just for us?" I had just run 20 miles, so I was really flustered. And what I wanted to say was, I did start a church just for you. Remember that church plant that I started in Birmingham 7 years ago? That's a 1/4 mile from here, literally, that I've invited you to come to many times and you haven't shown up. That's what I wanted to say, but I didn't. And I'm glad I didn't, because the more I think about what she said, the more I think about that invitation, the more I've started to wonder if it's me and my idea of what church has to be and my idea of what success needs to look like that's what needs to change. Because certainly Saint Jack of the running group and the rest of that motley crew have been proclaiming love, hope, and resurrection to me all along, and especially in that moment when I most needed to hear it. And what about that is not an expression of the body of Christ, the church? So thanks be to God that as soon as we think we know what's up, that pesky Holy Spirit's got a last ace up her sleeve, and we'll use it every single time to surprise, thwart, shock, bewilder, and amaze us, and guide us toward that new life. Amen.
Amen.